Today's program made possible by patrons like you. Welcome to where we celebrate music from the movies. From the golden age to present day, we've got it all covered. We talk to those in the entertainment industry and find out about their favorite scores. You found the podcast, What's the Score? I'm your host, Frank R. Wilson. So sit back, relax, grab a popcorn, and let's see what we'll be hearing today. Recognize that music? It's a favorite of our guest today. She's a professor, an award-winning author, and also an expert on gender and feminism in action films. Now, to be fair, not just any action films, but the films from the James Bond franchise. She's written several books on James Bond and his women, and she continues to write today with new projects coming on the horizon, which we'll talk about. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Funnell to the program.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure, Lisa. I've really looked forward to this. I've admired you from afar with some of your appearances on other podcasts and those sorts of things about James Bond. And I thought, what an interesting guest to maybe have on the program to talk about the music of James Bond, because maybe you have a different perspective on it. So I appreciate you joining us today. As I do with all my guests, I always like to find out a little bit about them. So I'd be curious if you could tell me a little bit about yourself, growing up, family, siblings, what your mom and dad did for livings, just kind of things that kind of led to growing up before you went to college. If you could kind of give us a little background on that, that'd be great.
So I am Canadian. I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, also known as the Hammer.
Okay.
My dad was an elementary school principal, and my mom was an elementary school teacher who specialized in primary education, so the lower grades. I do have a brother. His name is Dave. He is my best friend. He's a year older than me. And so we grew up very close together. We're still very close today. And in truth, all of my family is in education. My brother's a kindergarten teacher. And so I grew up knowing the value of education. I loved going to school. I was that kid who went to summer school for fun, right? Like other kids were playing sports and I wanted to go and do advanced programs because part of me is the fact that I'm an avid learner and I love to learn about the world and ideas. And I like to formulate my own ideas and opinions.
And in other words, you're a real nerd.
I am a huge nerd. And it's interesting because I think that is something that is so beautiful. And I always encourage people to nerd it out. Like find something that you're passionate about, connect with it and go all in. And I always have a huge respect for people who just love things or know things or can do things that I don't. Right. And so if you're really into like, I love Star Wars, but there's people who know so many details about Star Wars that I'm in awe. I'm like, how do you know these things? Tell me more. Let me learn from you. And I just think fandom in a general sense and the way that we nerd out to the things that make our pulse race, I think that's a beautiful thing and something that we've needed during this pandemic, right? As we've been waiting for scientists to help us out and the medical professionals for doing all of the great work that they're doing. We've connected and rerouted ourselves in pop culture and the things that make us feel safe, secure, whole, nostalgic, just keeping us grounded during this tough time.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious because of the way you described your family. I have to ask, was your father actually supervising or over your mother as an educator?
Oh gosh, no, they did not work in the same school. And it's interesting because my mom retired when she had my brother and myself. And so I really benefited from having a dedicated stay-at-home mom. And of course, my dad was very dedicated as well. But the two of them still talk about educational policy. And I call my parents every day. I
Oh,
miss them during this pandemic. I haven't seen them in a year and a half. So I
oh
call them at
my.
the same time every day. And we'll talk about educational policies. And invariably, the two of them do not agree. And they'll just start arguing and debating. And it's a beautiful thing to see, that positive dialogue, that constructive dialogue that happens in a relationship. And so, yeah, I think they're both great.
I love it. That's great. That's great. Gosh, I mean, do you don't have any, at least to my ears, you don't have any kind of a Canadian accent whatsoever. When did you become so Americanized?
I don't know. It's interesting. So I play on volleyball teams, and apparently when I get animated, when I get really excited, then some of the Canadian accent comes out. I don't know if I said that with an accent.
That was close. Yep.
But they wait. They will let me be the one on the team to call it out, and then they'll just look at me and start laughing. So it's there. It's not very deep or pronounced, but it's there when I get excited and animated. You just can't help it. Like the local just flows out.
So I did mention in the intro, but for those that are interested, you're actually located in Oklahoma now at the I think at University of Oklahoma, right? Or
Yes.
Oklahoma. Okay. That's got to be a lot different than Canada, I would think.
Yes, Oklahoma, USA, and Ontario, Canada are very different. I will say this, Oklahoma has some really, really nice people.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so like the friendliness that I'm used to in Canada is definitely comparable to the friendliness and the warmth that I've received here from my colleagues and from my friends. I've got great neighbors. Our houses just got hit with a huge hailstorm. And so just seeing the community come together, everybody standing outside being like, what do we do? Who do we call? And just lamenting collectively. It was actually like a very positive community building experience. But Oklahoma is, I would say, politically very different from where I come from. And so I think that's been more of an adjustment than anything else.
Sure. Yeah. But it's nice to know that you can come together in a situation where everybody's kind of, suffering and those sorts of things. That people are people, and it's, we want to help each other. So that's nice to hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, as people will find out as we kind of go through this program, you're really into the James Bond films. And so a lot of the things that we're going to focus on today will, as it pertains to music, will pertain to music from the Bond films. And I was delighted to see that one of the things that you chose was what is called the Fanfare, which is from the film A View to a Kill, written by John Barry. Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to choose that amongst one of your favorites.
So I know A View to a Kill does not get a lot of love, but it has a great soundtrack to it. And anytime I watch this film and anytime I see this particular moment where Fanfare comes in, I get goosebumps on my body. And so basically to set it up, so Roger Moore, this is his last James Bond film, and people have commented that James Bond is older and he's not as limber. And let me tell you, if you're his age, you might not be as limber as you were, 15 years beforehand when you started doing these types of actions. And the film has at its core like a really cool villainous duo. There's Mayday and there's Zorin, played by Grace Jones and Christopher Walken. And to me, they're the most compelling figures of the film. And so you have this moment where they've set, I don't know if it's City Hall on fire. And so Bond picks up Stacey Sutton and he climbs down the ladder on a fire truck. And when we think about action filmmaking, there's nothing really dynamic about watching somebody come down a ladder. Like it's not as if, bodies are in motion and punches are flying or things like that. And yet carrying somebody on your shoulders down a ladder is a pretty stressful and strenuous thing to do. And what I love about fanfare is that you have this music that makes me believe that this is the most heroic thing I've ever seen in my life. You have this slow melody of A View to a Kill, the title track co-written between John Barry and Duran Duran, and the use of brass to slowly play this melody codes it as heroic. And then the strings pop in, and the strings are telling me this is a really big deal of what we're seeing. And so I feel as though this is like classic John Barry saying, we've got this heroic action. I'm going to make you know that it is heroic, even though it's just James Bond walking down a ladder. And when I think about like music, if you were to say, hey, Lisa, I'm going to introduce you, on this stage to give a talk, I want it to be this song. Like it's just that commanding, like, here I am, world.
And I'm going to let my audience know, we talked before we started the program. She said, well, I don't know anything about music. Well, let me tell you something. She just demonstrated she knows a lot about music. She knows a lot about music just based on her description of this cue, which I thought was fabulous, absolutely fabulous. Let's have a listen for ourselves. This is from the film A View to a Kill. The cue is called Fanfare, and it's written by John Barry. Now, what I'm curious about is, and we didn't get into it yet, as you started into your college years and into your higher education and kind of what you wanted to do with your life, you decided to study women and gender studies, and so I'm kind of curious what went into your decision to take that path and want to study that particular subject.
So I did my undergraduate studies at McMaster University, and I was part of the arts and science program. And it was this specialized program where you basically got this comprehensive interdisciplinary education. And I was minoring in religious studies as I was doing it. And so I felt as though it was just a list of things that I was just crossing off. I'm like, biologist, don't want to do that. Physicist, can't do that. Physics was my Achilles heel. That is not my forte. And I started going through, and I was surrounded by a lot of students who were going into med school. And what I found was that what I wanted more than anything else was to want something as much as they wanted it. I wanted to feel that drive and that passion, that hunger to pursue
Mm-hmm.
something. I have the mental capabilities to kind of do a lot of things. But for me, I'm such a passion driven individual. I wanted to find my niche. And so I was interested in religious studies because I was interested in the stories that were being told throughout the years and in different places, different cultures about who we are, how do we understand the universe, how do we understand, who we are, how we relate to nature, how do we deal with horrible things that happen in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized that I didn't want to learn multiple languages in order to study these texts because languages are also not my forte. I mean, I feel as though I've like barely mastered English, and I'm like, I think I've reached the peak of where we're going to go linguistically here. And so I ended up working with a great professor, Mary O'Connor, and we came up with this project about studying gender, so studying masculinity, but I studied masculinity in Arnold Schwarzenegger films. And so I wrote this double unit honors thesis, doing this whole background on gender studies, doing this whole background on masculinity and gender in action. And I was a big Schwarzenegger fan because I love action films.
Yeah.
And so I ended up from there deciding to do a master's degree in popular culture at Brock University. And I ended up working with someone named Jim Leach. I took his cultural theory class, and he was teaching it on the James Bond franchise. And this is early 2000s. And this is just when James Bond studies as a field of studies as it was coming to its forefront. This is the first wave, first generation. He's part of this wave, writing about and thinking about and conceptualizing about James Bond. And he encouraged me to do my master's thesis on the Bond girl. And he's like, people have not written on this. So I ended up doing this quantitative content analysis of the Bond films only up to 2002 because the Craig era hadn't started at that point.
Yeah.
And I did this huge topography of the women of Bond and talking about the different waves and the different phases that they were going through. And that literally just put me on a path. I wrote my PhD on Chinese warrior women because I love Michelle Yeoh and I was interested in how she became as awesome as she did. She's featured in Tomorrow Never Dies. And then I just continued studying, researching, and learning about women and gender in film. And yes, I do a lot on James Bond, but I also publish and teach courses on women in action films in a general sense.
And I'm thinking, being an older gentleman as I am,
mm-hmm.
I've seen quite an evolution in how, particularly in action films, how, I don't know how to say this, how women are treated or viewed. Mm-hmm. It's obviously gone through a huge change over the decades. Did you find it? Was it difficult to kind of watch some of the older ones? Even the older Schwarzenegger films or any others. Did you kind of cringe a little bit and say, "Oh my gosh, did we used to accept that?" I mean, I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, it's a challenging thing because you have Lisa as a human being is going to act and react. And then you have Lisa as a professor who wants to understand why I'm acting and reacting. And so I never shy away from my feelings. If I'm bored, if I'm happy, if I'm sad, if I'm repulsed, I use that as a stepping stone to try to understand why I'm feeling that way. And it's great to actually trace the evolution of women in film because you can see things that we might have thought in the 80s and the 90s. There was all this talk about women performing masculinity and there was a lot of criticism of these women in the way that they were muscular and they were overtly masculine with behaviors and mannerisms. And then you saw the rise of early 2000s, things like Charlie's Angels. And you saw a lot of feminist scholars go back and be like, Sarah Connor, ooh, maybe that was an interesting way. So sometimes hindsight can allow us to understand the value and the valuing. But what I love is this desire to have women carve out a place in this very masculine space of action and really sending up the message that women can occupy this place. But I will say this, and I always say this, it's not enough. Most of the women that we see on screen tend to be white women. And I want to see women of color on screen. And I love diversity in all shapes, sizes, forms, colors, identities. And so what I really want in these spaces of action are stories about a variety of people focusing on different elements that can be considered heroic. We don't all have to be the same. And I would love for our media culture to really just push out that idea of like, difference is a great thing, and you can be heroic in many different ways because people in real life are heroic in many different ways. Yeah.
Well, and in defense of the Bond films, and we'll talk some more about that as time goes along, it's kind of interesting, from 1977 in the late 70s, they were kind of, they had recognized there needed to be a shift and had two strong women characters, maybe not as strong as one might like these days, but I mean, at the time, that was a big deal that these women were essentially equal to Bond. Would you agree, or tell me about that?
Yeah, so I would say I actually like the women of the 60s. I think that there's like a lot of diversity in the 60s. And what you saw in the 70s, it was just this broader sort of backlash to feminist gains. And you saw the Bond franchise trying to renegotiate, like, how do we understand women? But by the time they got to the 1970s, they were like, we should have a woman who's comparable to Bond as an agent. And so you do see women in the late 70s who are smart and intelligent and capable and competent, and Bond needs them in the mission. And this is the thing that I will say, talking to fans of the franchise, the stronger women are presented in the films, oftentimes the more fans actually like these women. Like, there's a reason why they're there. They're there to help Bond, to aid Bond, and they tend to make the films just more exciting and appealing rather than Bond simply dragging a love interest along. And I think this was sort of a tip and a turn back to that notion of having strong, capable, competent women. And again, in a variety of different ways. It doesn't have to, not everyone's going to be an agent. Not everyone's going to be an intellectual. I like when there's diversity in the women that I see on screen.
Yeah. And you made me think about it too. I mean, I can think back to several of the films in the 60s, even in the 60s, where you mentioned intelligent and smart, and capable. There were plenty of women that were, fit that description. They were eye candy to be sure. Yes, they were. But they weren't any shrieking violets. I mean, these were women that were sharp, smart, and kind of knew what they were doing. Would you agree?
Yeah, and a couple of them actually saved Bond. You look at Tatiana Romanova in From Russia with Love and Domino Derval in Thunderball. In both those films, you have the woman shooting. One shoots a hench person and one shoots the arch villain, saving Bond in the process. And I before the films became really formulaic and rigid, you saw a lot of flexibility about who women could be and what women could do, and having these almost like redemptive narratives. These are women who they have character growth and they change and they're able to claim some space and some power, even though both those women are not considered to be agents and both those women are not necessarily considered to be like empowered action women in sort of the traditional sense.
Yep. Yeah. Good point. I must compliment you. Another choice that you made for a cue that you wanted to play is happens to be one of my favorites as well. And as my listeners know, I'm a huge John Barry fan. He's just like, he couldn't do anything wrong. However, I do recognize some other composers occasionally, and this is one cue that I would say is amongst my favorites as well. You had chose a cue that's called Vesper from Casino Royale, written by David Arnold. Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to choose that amongst your favorites.
So there's a lot of reasons. First of all, I love David Arnold and what he did for the James Bond franchise. He stepped in at Tomorrow Never Dies, and he had a background in John Barry. He understood John Barry. He was a fan of John Barry. He did some musical composing and development in relation to John Barry, and John Barry recommended him. And so he is somebody who understood the sound of Bond, the way that instrumentation should work, and the importance of really strong, swelling melodies in defining key characters and key aspects. And so for me, the Vesper theme is important because Vesper Lynd is the first woman to get her own theme as a Bond girl. Now, there's an Elektra theme that came out, but arch villains always get their own musical themes. This is the first Bond girl, love interest, woman of Bond to get her own theme. And when I think about Vesper Lynd, I always think about Irene Adler and Sherlock Holmes. So in the world of Sherlock Holmes, Irene Adler was considered the woman for Sherlock. She's sort of this tragic figure, but she got under Sherlock's skin. She became a part of him. And then, after she was gone, Sherlock was never the same. And that's the same thing for Vesper Lynd. She's not presented as a Bond girl to Bond. She's presented as being the woman to Bond. And so she has her own theme to represent her importance to the world of Bond. And it is this light piano melody, which is sort of very gentle. It emphasizes her vulnerability in the film. I mean, she's somebody who's being manipulated by a variety of different factors. And then you have this sort of swelling of romantic strings that really, to me, suggests the romance that's going to happen. But the theme actually ends on sort of like it almost turns into a minor key, which represents like, this is not going to work out well. It's not going to work out well for her. It's not going to work out well for Bond. But I will say this. Spoiler, she doesn't make it to the end of the film. By the time we get to Quantum of Solace, the next film, Bond is still in love with Vesper Lynd. And so you have these moments where Bond is still connected to her. And you have the woman of that film, Camille Montez, telling him, like, you're still in love with another woman. We can't be together. And so you see Bond trying to just remain connected to Vesper Lynd. And he drinks the Vesper martinis. He tries to get drunk on them. He's trying to consume her and have her be inside of him. And then when he's thinking about her, you have the Vesper theme playing. This is in a different film, and yet the memory of Vesper Lynd looms large. And it is this music that is representing the melancholy that Bond is feeling as he's mourning the loss of her and trying to get over her. So I think it's a really important theme across two films, but I also think that it's just a brilliant, sad piece of music that represents her as a woman, as a figure, and as probably the first love of James Bond.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard someone who says, I know nothing about music, and yet did a brilliant job in explaining what you're about to hear. I mean that, seriously, Lisa. Brilliant. And I must tell you, too, it connected with me because I can remember as a young man, I won't say boy, I think I was a man at the time when I read the book. I mean, I kind of fell in love with Vesper even just through the book. Mm-hmm. And when I heard this music, when a legitimate Casino Royale was done, not the spoof, yeah, I mean, it moved me as well. So, and you described it perfectly, absolutely perfectly. Let's have a listen for ourselves. The cue is called Vesper. It's from the film Casino Royale, and it's written by composer David Arnold. We'll get back to our program in a minute. This program is done for the love of film and film music, plain and simple. However, it does take a huge investment in time and in fees for me to make the program work for you. I don't sell commercial time and don't really want to on this program. Rather, I'm kind of like a public broadcasting station. I need support from listeners like you. For as little as $3 a month, you can help me offset the time spent in putting the program together. Or maybe you just think of it as leaving a tip in the tip jar. Either way, if you can join up, there will be bonuses, like an additional 10 to 15 minute segment with our guest every week. Well, we'll play additional cues as well as ask some extra questions. And it's going to be only available to patrons. How do you sign up? Well, it's simple. You go to patreon.com/whatsthescore, and that's all one word. That's Patreon, that's patreon.com/whatsthescore. Check it out. We'd be grateful for your support. That's patreon.com. We've talked a lot about James Bond, but we really haven't explored exactly how it all got started. I mean, for the most part, most of us, especially guys like me in the 50s or in our 50s or 60s, it was a guy thing. All the guys like James Bond, but maybe the women wouldn't admit it. But, basically it was kind of a guy fan thing. And yet you seem to be a very passionate fan of the franchise. And so I'm kind of curious, how did that develop?
I watched the films with my dad growing up. He loved James Bond, and he shared with his children his passion for it. And I have a really great interview with my dad. I have my own I'm not sure if there's going to be more episodes, but there's an episode where I interview my dad about our connection. That. Yeah, it's on License to Critique. I think it's episode 12 or 13. But what we did was we had Sunday night dinners in front of the TV. This is in the 80s and in the 90s. And this was a big deal for us. We were not allowed to eat in front of the television. And so we would pick films that like the family could watch. And my dad and I would always pick the Bond films. My brother, he's kind of like, okay, well, James Bond, sure. And my mom, she loves Sean Connery. So that was never an issue or a problem for her. But it really became a source of connection for my dad and I to watch these films and connect with them. And I will say this, my dad and I still to this day talk about James Bond. That's what happens during our phone calls. It might be educational policy, but oftentimes we talk about James Bond, the work that I'm doing, different thoughts. If I'm on a podcast, I'll tell him the topic and we just sort of discuss our ideas. And it's a point of connection between the two of us. And I've talked to a lot of fans who have these types of experiences. Oftentimes it's a parent, maybe a sibling or a close friend who introduced them. And then it becomes a point of connection based on shared passions. Yeah. And I think that's incredibly important. So for me, a lot of Bond is tied up with this nostalgia. And as I'm sitting here talking to you, I just sort of turn my sights just to the right and I have I love collecting movies. I don't like this digital era, but at the bottom, I have the VHS copies that we used to watch together. Those are considered my prized possessions. And if we ever have like a flooding warning, the first thing I do is grab a box, pick those up and put them to high ground because those are mine. Like, I don't know if I'll ever watch them again because they're probably fragile at this point. But to me, they represent just a connection to my dad and to these 1980s, 1990s great moments that we had together. So yeah.
So, and do you guys agree on most of the things you talk about, or are there disagreements about the films or whatever? I'm just kind of curious. I mean, is it? Do you have some interesting spirited discussions?
There are some spirited discussions. I think the The thing that he does not like the Daniel Craig era. There's no love for it. Anytime we talk about it, or if there's ever anything being recorded, I have to tell him, Dad, be nice. And there's people who are listening who like the Craig era because he just doesn't like the direction. He loves the fun, episodic, energetic, full of gadgets and quitty whips type of Bond films. And those are my preference too. I mean, we're a very kind of like funny, jokey type of family. Right. So that just feeds into our funny bones. So he's not a fan of the Daniel Craig era. And I understand where he's coming from. So I just sort of let him express his point of view. And he's like, am I wrong? And I'm like, your opinion's your opinion. Some people disagree, but I understand and I love you through it, Dad.
Well, you know what? And being someone as let me think here, as a 7-year-old sitting on the second row of a cinema watching Goldfinger, and some of my listeners will know the story. It was just by chance. I mean, it was not something that was desired. We just happened to stumble upon it. Mm-hmm. I just loved it. As a 7-year-old, I felt, you see that golden girl painted on the bed. I'm his heart. Where am I going with this? I'm trying to remember where I was
childhood nostalgia.
Well, yeah, that the Daniel Craig films. It's interesting. I have mixed emotions about it as well. Absolutely loved Casino Royale because it stuck to the book for the most part. I loved that. That was great. But it was like, okay, let's move along.
Yes.
Let's get back to the formula. And so I kind of understand where your dad's coming from. And yet, I can kind of see why people, they like the drama, the backstories, all the,
it's too much. Come on. It's too much. They've taken this. Look,
I think it is. Yeah. All right. Let's just admit it. It is. It's too much. I'm sick of it.
Oh my gosh! I saw Spectre, and I'm like, "What are we doing here?" I want a standalone narrative. Let Bond do his job and be a hero. Like he doesn't need Brofeld. Like
let's have some fun.
Yes. And the thing with Daniel Craig is as an individual, he does have a sense of humor, and I want to give him the opportunity to shine. And he brought in Phoebe Waller-Bridge for No Time to Die for a reason, because he's like, oh my gosh, inject some humor and life into this, because I think that he deserves to have that type of a film. So I'm throwing it out there. I have a lot of hopes for No Time to Die, and I think Casino Royale was really high up there. And I think there was the goal to just keep replicating Casino Royale instead of where do we go from here? Pivot. Like give me some pivoting instead of just being stuck in the stairwell.
Yeah, so, fair enough. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Well, I was intrigued by the next choice that you had for a cue to mention. This is from the film Octopussy, and the cue is called That's My Little Octopussy. So written by John Barry. You kind of tell me a little bit about why you wanted to include that amongst one of your favorites.
So it's probably no surprise for people who know me. I grew up watching Octopussy. And I think about it. I am growing up in the 1980s, and my heroes were Wonder Woman on television and Princess Leia in Star Wars. Yeah. And so when I would watch Octopussy, I was always inspired by having this group of women who were smart entrepreneurs and could protect themselves. And I always felt empowered by that type of an image and that type of a message. So there's a lot of love in me for this movie Octopussy and showing me the constructive potential that exists for women. Sense. There's many different pathways.
Makes sense.
What I find interesting about, so I love the song because it's sort of this romantic sweeping adaptation of All Time High, which is the title track. And there's strings and I believe there's some clarinet. It's highly romantic and it's sending us this message that Bond and Magda are making love. And it's kind of this red herring because she's not his primary love interest at all. When Octopussy, played by Maud Adams, comes into the forefront, Magda just sort of goes into the backdrop. She doesn't die. She's still part of the film. So I always find it interesting that you have this hyper romantic track, but not for the primary love interest. And I will say this, the way that the scene ends is like on my bucket list. So you have Magda like wrapping this dress on. She ties it to the banister, flips off, and then just like descends with like so much grace. And I'm like, I want to learn how to descend from a balcony by my dress looking like that. That's up there with like cracking safes. Like I have like a Bond bucket list, and there's a jetpack on that list as well. But I always thought that it was like this beautiful track, but it doesn't fully make sense in terms of like the overall chronology of the film. Like he falls in love with somebody else who is the actual Octopussy. So yeah.
And to make this even more powerful, not to brag, but I've been to Udaipur and been at those hotels and, where they had dinner and, by the pool and all, it just makes it even all the more realistic. It's amazing. It's an amazing city and amazing people. So I hope, I wish for you at some point in your life that you get a chance to visit there. It's quite amazing. Well, let's have a listen to this cue ourselves. This, again, is from the film Octopussy. The cue is called That's My Little Octopussy, and it's written by John Barry. I know we focused on James Bond films, but you already mentioned Arnold Schwarzenegger and some other action films. I'm kind of curious. Are there other action films that you like that maybe you've studied and that you follow and maybe talk about in some of your classes?
Absolutely. So, I have written an entire book about Chinese warrior women. So, I have this entire other area of expertise looking at specifically Chinese women as action stars. But I have a profound, deep love for like Hong Kong martial arts action films.
Ah,
And what I love about them is the creativity and the collaboration that takes place on set. The fact that you have actors and choreographers coming together and sometimes even just like negotiating the movements that are taking place. It is more of a collaborative endeavor. And you have these great action star choreographers who are martial arts practitioners. And so they understand how bodies move. And so they understand how bodies should interact with each other and then how to film them in the most effective way. And what we saw in the late 1990s, early 2000s was not just a crossover of Chinese film talent to Hollywood, but it was the Chinese filmmaking talent coming over to Hollywood. So someone like Wu Ping-yoon, you may have never heard of him, but if you've watched The Matrix and Charlie's Angels and Kill Bill, you'll know that he and his brother worked in various capacities on these early films. And so I think it's really important to understand that cinema and film is this global, interconnected cultural entity. And I love drawing attention in my classes to how this intersection of these different traditions, these cultural flows can actually work to benefit different like cinema systems themselves. And then on top of that, I've studied just like Hollywood action women who are kind of awesome. So
yeah. Now, all right. It's been what, almost 40 years since I've been to college. And I'm thinking to myself, gosh, what I would have given to attend a class that said, we're going to study women in film, or we're going to study film, or this. I mean, yeah, it sounds like a dream come true. I would love to have taken a class like that. So what are some of the topics that you cover in some of the classes that you teach, and what kind of students does it draw? Does that make sense? Kind of what I'm asking?
yeah, so my courses are in the Women's and Gender Studies department, but they're also cross-listed with Film and Media Studies department. So I get students with a background in WGS and with a background in FMS, but I also get students who are just really interested in these topics and want to take my class. And so we study everything from aspects of genre, so understanding what a genre is, how action films work, what is expected image-wise, body-wise, gender-wise. And then we also talk about aspects of identity, right? Representation of gender, race, sexuality, nationality, and ethnicity, issues of ability, and how those are represented. And then, of course, how they change over time. That's my big thing. You know, I study, whether I'm studying action women or James Bond, when you think about James Bond, we're hitting the 60th anniversary next year. That's a great subset of text to study where you can really see the growth, the evolution of gender politics, geopolitics, racial politics. You can see the development of cinema. You can see the development of sound effects across special effects. You can see how they were precursors to the development of blockbuster action filmmaking and how they were then afterwards responding to trends. Like, it's a great set of films to study. And I love doing trans-textual analysis, and trans means across the prefix. So it just means finding meaning making and connection across texts. And that's what I love to do.
Geez, you sold me. Man, I wish I could take one of your classes. Okay, I love it. Yeah, you're right. I love it. I love the way you described it. That's terrific. Let's take a weird left turn, I guess, if you will, for a moment. Most of the cues, well, all the cues basically that we were going to play for today's program have to do with James Bond, but there was one you mentioned that was a little bit off the beaten path. The cue is called No Man's Land, and it's from a film called Wonder Woman. And you had a particular affinity for this particular cue, and I thought it was important that we include that today. Tell us a little bit about why you wanted to include that in your list of favorites.
So, like many people, I was really taken in by the movie Wonder Woman, the original one that came back a few years ago. Not Wonder Woman 1984, the one that predates it, the original one, starring Gal Gadot and directed by Patty Jenkins. And for me, this particular cue is focusing in on a key scene, and it's called No Man's Land. And sometimes when I feel like I'm disempowered, I will just put on this particular scene because I do find it empowering. And what it is you have Wonder Woman And Chris Pine's character, whatever his name is basically telling her, like, this is a particular zone, no man can cross it, we're sort of at a stalemate, and people are suffering, and there's nothing that we can do about it. And this is when Wonder Woman says, well, I'm going to do something about it. And I love the way that the music defines these actions. So we have these sort of strings, these violins of some sort. But they have they're very quiet and they're very separated. So it's only like a note here that's drawn out and a note there. And this is happening when she puts her head down, and I think she puts on her tiara or headpiece. And it continues as she climbs the ladder. And then we start to get some percussion as she's taking those steps, and we see her shield after her cloak comes down. And then the second she steps out, and we get this either a long shot or a medium long shot. So either from the knees up or feet up, as she's walking into the battlefield, that is where the brass starts to kick in. And it's these notes that are coming out. And it's sort of this melodic rise of the instrumentation as she's walking forward and gaining steam. And then you have this layering of these strings that are emphasizing every step that she's taking. And you see that it's not just her intention that is strengthening and swelling with the music, but it's the belief of the men behind her saying, holy crap, what is she doing? And Chris Pine's character wanting to give her backup. And the music keeps layering on as their belief in their ability to take out this particular enemy sort of moves forward. And you have a great shot of her behind the shield taking fire. And once the grenade explodes, then you get sort of almost like this explosion of a melody as she's able to leap over and take out all of the opponents. And so anytime I feel as though like I'm feeling a little bit disempowered, it's this notion that like, yes, I can do it. And courage is something that builds and develops over time. And sometimes it means just a belief in yourself. And sometimes other people might get behind you. But I've always felt that like the scene is meaningful. Yes, Gal Gadot. Yes, the imagery, but it's the music that just like takes my emotions and pushes them along. And I believe in her because the
once
music
again,
is
Lisa
telling me to believe in
has
her.
shown her lack of knowledge on music. And describing this cue, which I'm delighted now to play because I'm really excited about it based on her description. Again, it's called No Man's Land. It's from the film called Wonder Woman, and I'm not familiar with this composer, so I'm interested in hearing it. It's by composer Rupert Gregson Williams. Let's have a listen. Okay, I've been having a little bit of fun and joking with you about not knowing a lot about music, and yet your descriptions are amazing. I mean that sincerely. Your descriptions are very intuitive and amazing about what you're hearing. So I'm curious. Maybe it's a ridiculous question, but
So
are
yes,
you a fan of
here's the
film music?
thing. I may have never seen the film, but I listen to film music like I just go on YouTube and I listen to like different sort of soundtracks and film music because I find it inspiring. And usually it's from action films and like what would we consider Lord of the Rings? Like sort of like fantasy. I mean, that entire soundtrack of Lord of the Rings, it's just straight fire.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just saying that. But it's just I find it so incredibly inspiring and empowering. And sometimes lyrics distract me. Like they move my train of thought towards thinking about the lyrics. What I like about film music is I can get lost in the emotion and in the intention, and I can allow my own thoughts to be creative. And so maybe I can work through something theoretical that's just not happening. Maybe I can get inspired. Like before I go speak on podcasts and stuff, I listen to soundtrack music in order to get me all pumped up and to get my emotions aligned in the proper way. And so yeah, I like I like this type of music.
Have you ever? It's just going to lead to another question I have. And I've had the opportunity to do this. By any chance, have you had an opportunity to watch a rough
I
cut
don't
of
think
a
I've ever
film
I've
without
done
music?
watch-alongs for I'm on a podcast called James Bond and Friends, and we've done watch-alongs. And when we watch it, we have no sound on so that we can talk to each other over it.
But I mean, actually watching a film that has, real time watching it, and there hasn't been any music laid into it yet, because it's I mean, it's so flat. It's amazing how it's so flat, because I have seen that. And you see a scene that has no music backing it up. Sometimes the scene doesn't need it, by the way. We can talk about that. But there are times when music really is needed. And it's amazing what it adds to a scene in a film. So I that's why I was kind of curious. I don't know if you should try and watch, if you have an opportunity, watch a film that hasn't been, there hasn't been a music track left, and you'll be amazed how dead it is.
I will say there's one exception because I'm looking at my movie case, which is in front of me. There's a movie called Haywire, starring Gina Carano, and I think it was directed by Soderbergh. I could be making that up. But like, it's really supposed to emphasize mixed martial arts, and she's a mixed martial artist. And the action sequences don't have any music. And what it does is, if you're so used to listening to cinematic music, especially during action sequences, usually it has like a quick pace. It's designed to get your pulse racing. It's supposed to emphasize the kinesthetics that are taking place on screen. And then you have like this music that is like moving your pulse, and it's this overall experience for your body. But in that film, the lack of sound actually emphasizes the brutality of her fight sequences with all these different men, and how like it emphasizes like the grunts and the slapping of bodies and crashing into but it's probably the only film that I've seen that has done it in a way that is intentional and actually really effective.
I couldn't agree more, which is one of the things, and I don't know if John Barry had a choice in this. But there were several times in the James Bond series where there were times when he could have put music in a fight scene or whatever it was going on. But actually, he chose, or the director, I don't know who, no, we're just going to let the sounds of the scene, the organic what's going on in the scene, drive it. We don't need music to kind of make it extra special. Yeah. And I loved that. I think economy use of music is actually just as important as in your face music, if that makes sense.
Intentional. And I feel the same way even about like physical action sequences. Like having an action sequence just to fill up that time, that doesn't necessarily work for me. Like it should be intentional action. And then you can emphasize, like not every moment has to be an action, but if you're going to give me action, give me good action, give it to me for a reason, shoot it well, choreograph it well, give me, an appropriate soundtrack, but don't just overdo it, because if you overdo it, I'm not going to have the same type of reaction to it. We need spaces to pause and to digest. It was interesting, as we were preparing for this, I was listening to African Rundown from Casino Royale as well. And like, even in that soundtrack, there are pauses where like it's this chase sequence that is happening, and there's all this percussion that's going off, except when there are these moments, right, where there's a jump happening or a different type of moment, and it's just sort of like it's almost silence, or it's like a violin string that's just being held. And it's not even like me catching my breath. Those are the moments where I found that I was holding my breath. Like it was having that impact where I was like, it's like we're running and then we're like, what's going on? And then like running on. And I thought it was so incredibly effective in the way that it was, the way that that music is laid out to have that type of reaction. And I think it goes down to your point of intentionality, like doing it for a particular reason, for a particular effect, rather than just giving us every single instrument that's possible and like just shaking our roots. I love this idea of intentionality. So I think it's a brilliant point.
Yeah, and what a great segue, because one of the cues you chose was African Rundown from Casino Royale, and you've already described exactly the way you like it. And it's you're right. Sometimes these days I almost think that composers feel like they have to compete with sound effects, so they got to make the music really loud. But I don't know if this is an example of that, but I thought it was extremely effective, and I love the fact that you chose this. So let's have a listen for ourselves. Again, the cue is called African Rundown. It's from the film Casino Royale, and it's written by David Arnold. Okay. Now, you may not like this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Have the Bond films lost their way?
Ooh.
Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah. I understand the question, and I actually think the answer is yes. And here's the reason why. So I watched Casino Royale. I hated it at first, love it now. So I hated it
Yep,
because it
I
was
was the same
different.
way. I was the same way.
Yeah. I reacted to it and I'm like, what the heck is this? And then the more that I studied it, the more that I watched it, the more that I think it's actually a beautiful, like it's beautifully shot. The music is on point for it. There's
Absolutely.
emotion. Like that is a great standalone film, whether or not you like James Bond. But I feel
Absolutely.
as though the rest of them have become incredibly repetitive and stale. And I will say this, I've watched other films in the late 2000s and 2010s that feel more like James Bond films than the Bond films themselves. And it makes me a little bit sad. The Bond franchise right now is lacking the humor and the lightness and the gadgets and all of sort of like the wonder that came from Bond. You know, Bond going into different places and having great technology and kind of being amazing and doing great stunts and just being awe-inspiring. That is part of like the action, the adventure, the spectacle that I think that is missing when we go down such a dark, melodramatic, everything is personal type of direction. And it's really sad when I watch like The Kingsman, which I mean, first of all, just saying at the end of The Kingsman, it's actually a woman who was the Kingsman who was then sent into space and like was away from the climax. So I always have to point that out that I don't like that part of The Kingsman, just throwing it out there. But that film has almost like comic book inspired action. It has larger than life characters. It has an emphasis on fashion and it has a brightness, even though the action on it is actually quite graphic. But it's one of those things where I watch it, I'm like, that feels more to me like James Bond than what we are getting from Eon. So I would love to see a return or a pivot back after the Daniel Craig era. I think this is probably his last one. Where do we go from here? I would love it if anybody from Eon would like to talk to me the direction. I am here. I will consult. I have thoughts and feelings. I have access to the Bond fan community. I know what different people are thinking. Let me help.
Well, it sounds to me like and you might be a good conduit for this because I think I'm guessing, you can confirm or deny.
Sure.
You want a connection to the past while still recognizing that the world's a different place now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you can have a connection with the past without remaking the past. Like this idea that we're going to have to do a reference to this film and then we got to throw this in because this is what happened. There's a way to recognize the essence of the past and the energy and the lightness and, you know, the overarching feeling without actually having to just constantly go back and throw back. I don't want to say that that's lazy, but it feels kind of lazy to me.
Well, I mean, Bond was a chauvinist, let's face it, as were most manly men in the 50s and the 60s, right? I mean,
sure, but Bond also changes in many ways over time. So the character has evolved over time. And it is my question that I really put out there is like, we're talking, for instance, a lot about sexual consent. And I think affirmative consent's really important. I think what we showcase in our media sends messages to people about what is considered like appropriate conduct in a film. And so I look back on the James Bond films, I see issues of lacking of consent and some sexual violence. And I look at it and say, it was never okay. This was there in the past. It was never okay. But then I pivot and look forward and say, we don't need to include this component moving forward. If you want to make billions and billions of dollars off of Bond and reach the widest possible audience, recognize that there are women who are fans of this franchise who want to support it and who feel oftentimes really uncomfortable watching these scenes. And there are a lot of men who feel uncomfortable watching those scenes too. And is it really necessary to include that component moving forward? Or is it about Bond just being a really great hero and having strong women around him who feel valued and validated?
yeah.
I lean towards that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. The one of the cues you chose, and it's a favorite of mine as well.
Ooh. Oh.
It's interesting. It was the last opportunity that John Barry had to score a James Bond film, and I think it was a terrific effort on his part.
Mm-hmm.
The cue you chose was called Hercules Takes Off.
Yes.
From the film The Living Daylights. So talk to us a little bit about why you wanted to choose that as one of your favorites.
So I would say that The Living Daylights has one of the best Bond soundtracks. I'm just throwing it out there. We can debate that on social media, but I actually really like this entire soundtrack. And what I like about this song is that it is a faster and more dynamic version of the title track sung by a-ha. So I'm not really compelled by a-ha's version of it, but this version I'm into. And you have like this rapid beat in the background that's so very 80s. I love 80s stuff. So it sounds like it's 80s oriented, but it also sounds kind of like a ticking clock, emphasizing sort of the timeliness of the actions taking place. There's a bomb that is going to go off. And so your actions have to be heroic, but they have to be quick. Like you need to get this plane off of the ground. And then you have the use of brass coding the actions of Bond as being heroic. Do, 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 do. I'm never going to have a singing career. But it's so like, the melody itself, it is so incredibly positive, and to me, it sounds so incredibly heroic. And then you have like a layering of this brass with other instruments that are heightening and elevating the sound. Once you start adding in like violins and stuff like that, and layering it and thickening it out, it just makes me support the plight that I'm seeing. And then you have this punctuation of these like bump, ba-da-da-dump, these types of brass notes throughout that are just pushing me forward. It's creating a sense of dynamism in the score. It's elevating my pulse. And so I just love the pace, the flow, the feel. And I'm just so into the actions on screen, not because it's literally Bond just like letting a plane go up in the air. Again, this is sort of like James Bond walking down a ladder, James Bond flying a plane. But it's this music that is making it and coding it as being incredibly heroic, noble, but also it's time sensitive. So we need to get this particular mission done. So that's why I like Hercules Taking Off.
Jeepers. I mean, I need you to describe my favorite cues. I mean, you do a better job than I ever could. I mean, it's fabulous. I totally concur. It's fabulous. And again, this is another example. If you want to, turn the volume down and watch this scene.
It's boring.
It's not nearly as effective as it is when there's the music there. So let's have a listen ourselves. This is again, the cue is called Hercules Takes Off. It's from the film The Living Daylights, and it's written by John Barry. Okay, to kind of switch gears a little bit, what's in your future? What do you have planned down the pike, as it were?
In terms of work?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I've got lots of Bond stuff coming out. So
Is it
right
only
now,
just Bond stuff or other stuff?
no. So I have two anthologies coming out on James Bond. One with Christoph Lindner called Resisting James Bond, and it's looking at the Daniel Craig era and different sort of representations of oppression. And then I have one with Klaus Dodds called Global James Bond, and it's looking at how the world is represented in the James Bond franchise, but also how local filmmakers from around the world actually made their own versions of James Bond. So I've got those two books with a whole bunch of contributors working on it. And then I have another series of books I'm working on. One is called Screening Me Too, Rape Culture in Hollywood. That's coming out in March next year. And it's looking at, in the wake of the Me Too movement, can we look back at Hollywood and see and sort of trace some of these ideas and representations across genre. And we're working on a spin-off book called Streaming Me Too, looking at this particular topic in relation to the television industry and streaming services in the US.
So in other words, other than that, you've got nothing going on.
Nothing else going on. I don't know, like balancing 4 books at the same time is, I mean, I don't know what's wrong with me. That's really ambitious. Like
that's a lot. That's a lot to say the least. That's a lot, but I applaud you for that. So how do people, if people are interested in kind of, seeing what you've got going on, if they want to follow you or those sorts of things, what would you recommend how they keep in touch with what you've got going on?
So you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, Dr. Lisa Funnell, 2 N's and 2 L's in Funnel. I think my website's lisafunnell.com. Yep. You can find me on Amazon if you want to see any of my books. But feel free to follow me. I try my best to tweet and post regularly, but as you can tell, I'm also very busy with a lot of book projects. So I have to just split my time accordingly.
Folks, let me tell you something. This woman is a delight. She's so bright and intelligent and really gives a different perspective on action films, but also on, if you're interested in James Bond as I am, gives a wholly different perspective. And as you can tell from her descriptions of the cues that we chose today, I mean, she'll say that she doesn't understand music, but she does. And so that was just terrific. Lisa, look, I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. I hope you've enjoyed it as well.
This has been so much fun. And I will say this, I specialize in visual representations, but the visual in film is always defined by the sound in film. And I love a new challenge. And so coming on here and thinking through the way that music really amplifies the images that we see has been fun for me. I like being challenged, and I like challenging myself to adopt a different lens and see films in a different way. So this was a great opportunity, and I was happy to do it.
Oh, excellent. I'm so glad to hear that. Thanks, Lisa, again. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Again, I want to thank our patrons for those of you that support us. By the way, Lisa will be sharing a little bit of extra bonus material with our patrons here in a little bit. But I want to thank all of you for listening to the program today. I hope you found it interesting and insightful and heard some great music. And it's my pleasure to bring it to you. There's only one thing left to say, and that's simply this. My name is Frank R. Wilson. My time is up. I thank you for yours. And thanks for listening to What's the Score?